The creators of TFT have removed Augment Data from match history so we can no longer do the little data checking and have to actually know how to play the game by picking augments using intuition and critical thinking. But in this video, I'm going to teach you all how to pick every type of augment regardless of what is currently strong, and this will give you new ideas on how to approach augments in this new era of TFT. And as a special bonus, at the end of the video, I'll also give you a secret tip on how to get implied data on augments, along with when, why, and how to play with many of the new augments introduced to the game. So first, if you are new to TFT, what is an augment? An augment appears on stage 2-1, 3-2, and 4-2 of every game, and they give your team some type of bonus. Some people consider augments game defining, including myself, meaning that they drastically affect the outcome of your game, which makes it very important to know what to pick and when. Typically, augments can be categorized into 3 categories, maybe 5 if you count some of the hybrids, and they are as follows: combat, econ, and item augments. These are the main 3, and then there are also trait and hero augments if you want to separate those out. There are also different tiers of augments, and this changes every single game, so you could get offered either a silver, gold, or prismatic augment. Silvers are the weakest, prismatics are the strongest, but everyone gets the same choice, so it's obviously an equalized power level throughout each game. An example of a silver combat augment is backup, which gives your team attack speed if 4 allies start in the back 2 rows. This is typically good for comps that don't need too many units in the front, such as having a solo or duo tank, often paired with items like Gargoyle Stoneplate. Piercing Lotus is an example of a gold combat augment where it gives your team some critical strike chance, and their abilities can also critically strike. You also get a Shred and Sunder effect after you crit, which reduces armor and magic resistance. This is great for teams that are lacking in Shred and Sunder effects, which are almost required by every single team comp, either through an item, a unit, a trait, or in this case, an augment. Critical strike chance is also typically good on units that rely more on their ability for damage rather than their auto attacks. But obviously, everyone benefits from crit. Calculated Enhancement gives you 4 random champions in your last row, 35 AD and AP, and this is a great example of a prismatic augment that powers 4 damage dealers in your back line. And it's also good if your units are lacking in AD and AP. For example, if you built your carry with a lot of attack speed and a lot of critical strike chance, maybe even some damage amplification, the extra AD and AP will help much more than getting an augment which gives you more attack speed. This is because it's better to scale your units in a balanced way rather than go all in on one stat unless there's a unique circumstance. But hopefully these examples shine a light on what qualifies as a combat augment in each tier. Now let's get into why and when you should pick a combat augment. Combat augments are actually great for scaling into the late game, and while they do provide like combat stats, they are typically not that great to win streak with in the early game, oddly enough. This is because they typically give fewer stats than item augments, which we will cover later, and those are better for win streaking. Combat augments are best used when you have full items on your primary carry and tank. This is because units can only hold 3 items at a time, so once they're maxed out on items, the only way to make them stronger is through giving them like a crazy amount of trait bonuses or giving them something like a combat augment. Obviously, getting a combat augment might be easier than going for crazy traits because, of course, we can only add so many units to our team each game. Given all this information, combat augments are best taken on stage 4 and are the worst type of augment on stage 2. Stage 2, you prefer having either an econ augment or a win streak augment. Econ augments are better at econ, and item augments are better at win streaking. If you do end up picking a combat augment on stage 2, it's definitely not the end of the world, but just recognize that you might have a rougher time than usual, and you should play around that fact. There are some exceptions to this rule, obviously. There are some scaling combat augments, such as investment strategy, where your champions gain permanent max health per interest you earn, and combat augments that give you permanent stacks or stats are obviously better the earlier that you take them. Typically, combat augments help create the highest cap for most team compositions, because if you are able to get your team built without needing extra gold from an econ augment, and if you are able to get good items on your carries without the help of an item augment, you'll easily be able to demolish other teams with identical boards as you, but have an econ augment or item augment instead in the late game. And this is literally just because you have more stats than them. Lastly, while it isn't always necessarily the case, I would consider combat augments a type of 1st or 8th augment choice for the reasons we stated before. Now let's go into some examples of when to pick a combat augment. So for our examples for this video, we're going to look at Spencer TFT. He's been one of the top players in North America for like 10 sets, 12 sets, something like that. But here he's in stage 4 and he's going to be taking a combat augment because, again, he already has 2 econ augments from the start and an item augment. He took Shimmer Scale and Raining Gold, so now he needs some power on his team. He's got items on all his units, so you're just going to go for Bulky Buddies or maybe the Glass Cannon. He decides to go for Bulky Buddies in this case. In another game where he is going to take Ghost from Friend's Pass and skip Scrap, even though Scrap is very OP in this meta right now, he is going to be forcing the family comp, and in order to do that, you might want to take a scaling combat augment by using Ghosts of Friend's Pass. You could also take this combat augment when you're lose streaking in the early game, because again, you'll get the benefit later. Next, let's cover Econ Augments. Econ Augments are pretty simple. They're augments that help you save or make gold, and this can be in the form of extra rerolls, bonus experience, extra copies of champions, or just straight up gold. An example of a silver reroll augment is Reroll Transfer, which gives you 3 free shop rerolls for every unused augment reroll, but it does not include the round that this augment is selected. This is good when you need to take advantage of rerolls, such as in a reroll comp. Sometimes we make TFT more complicated than it needs to be. A gold augment is forward thinking, where you lose all your gold, but after 6-player combats you gain the original amount back and another 70 gold. While this is takeable regardless of your gold amount, it's best if you actually spend all your gold before you take this augment. This is because you weren't going to be able to be making interest anyways, and you don't want to die while you cannot spend gold. So you literally just get 70 gold for free after 6 PvP rounds, which is an incredible amount for a gold augment. If we compare this to Balance Budget Plus, which is an augment that was removed from the game for this set, but that one only gives 40 gold, but it happens over 4 rounds. And finally, we have Prismatic Augments. An example of a Prismatic Economy augment is called Prismatic Pipeline, which grants an additional Prismatic Orb at the next non-player combat round. It also makes gold and Prismatic Orbs give even more loot. This is good when you are already strong or have a lot of health to take a delayed Econ Augment. It's also strong on maps where you have bonus loot such as Scuttle Puddle. Now that we know what Econ Augments are, when should we pick them? Typically, Econ Augments are better for top 4s than they are for winning because it pretty much guarantees that you'll hit your desired team comp. So you'll be a lot stronger than other people who did not hit, but obviously weaker than those who got lucky and hit and had a combat or item augment instead. The times where you can get first place with an Econ Augment is usually when you are able to get a really high level, or get multiple 2-star legendaries or something crazy like a 3-star 4-cost. But here are the types of Econ Augments and when to pick them. Reroll Augments are something that gives rerolls or a higher chance at a certain tier of units, and you should obviously pick these when you are playing a reroll comp. Leveling and XP augments, such as those that give you bonus XP, are great when you're going for a fast 8 or fast 9 comp. Both reroll and XP augments give you an indirect source of gold, but there are also gold augments, and normally gold augments are just straight up worse than leveling and reroll augments if you assume the game is balanced. This is because gold is flexible, so your value is not being tunnel visioned into either only rerolling or only leveling. For example, Explosive Growth and Balanced Budget give XP and gold every turn for the next 4 turns respectively, but Explosive Growth gives 1 more XP than Balanced Budget gives gold. Does that mean that Balanced Budget is strictly worse than Explosive Growth? No, because you can take Balanced Budget to play a reroll comp, for example, but Explosive Growth is horrible for reroll comps because it'll overlevel you despite giving you more value. Next, we have Champion Econ Augments, and these are not to be confused with Hero Augments, which will be covered shortly. Champion Augments give you additional copies of champions or change your shop odds. For example, Rigged Shop makes your next shop and every 4 shop rerolls all 3-cost champions, which is obviously great in 3-cost reroll. There are other ones that strictly give you a ton of champions instead. The last category of Econ Augments that I forgot to mention before are Health Augments, such as Titanic Titan, which increases your current and max player health by 20. Health Augments are essentially gold augments because they allow you to make interest for a few more turns, but have the added benefit of really saving your butt in some cases. It's also pretty good if you are playing something like Chem Baron, where getting an extra loss helps out your team a ton. Econ Augments are pretty simple stuff. If you're doing a certain strategy such as reroll, obviously take the reroll augment. If you don't know what direction your game is going, get a gold augment, and if you're fast aiding, get an XP augment. There are also some Econ Augments that require you to win, such as Kingslayer, and you would take that in a situation where you are already strong. Now let's get into some examples of when you should pick one. So in this stage 2, he's got 2-star Draven, 2-star Darius. He's looking for that family comp still because he's just hard forcing it every single game. So he's going to be looking for those reroll augments. So reroll the middle one, reroll the right one. He's looking at Heroic Grab Bag, but Starry Night a little bit better. Heroic Grab Bag, one of the weaker Econ Augments in the early game for reroll. So he ends up going Starry Night. In a different game on stage 3-2, he has offered Anger Issues, Buried Treasures, and Tiniest Titans Plus. What do you think he'll pick here? He's got a very weak board, and he's at 69 health, one of the lowest health in the game. What do you want in this situation? Well, if you're low health and an augment shows up that gives you health, you might want to take that augment, so he takes Tiniest Titans Plus. Item augments give you items, and items are great for powering up your main carry or tank or even some of your secondaries. They come in a variety of forms, such as full items, which are just items, components, which can be used to build items, radiant items, which are empowered versions of full items, often worth around like 2 or 2.5 times the value of one full item, artifact items, which are a different tier of items valued at around 1.5 items. And lastly, we have support items. However, I would categorize support items as more of like a combat augment and a separate type of item category. These are valued at 1.5 to 2 items depending on the game state. In the early game, they're a bit worse. In the late game, they're a bit better in most cases. An example of a silver component augment is Eye for an Eye, where for every 15 allied champions that die, gain a random component. This is great if you have not fully committed to a comp yet and can use the extra components later on in the game. You can actually lose streak with this augment to get a component a bit earlier. A gold item augment would be something like Pyromaniac, which gives you a red buff and your burns deal 50% increased damage. This is great if you're lacking burn and wound effects, or if it is one of the best in slot items for one of your units. If you are wondering what a best in slot item is, head on over to the website bunnymuffins.lol and go to /meta, and you'll be able to see how I rank every single team composition along with their best in slot items down here in the text or in the image. But an example of a prismatic artifact augment would be something like Artifactory, where at the start of each turn, your bench completed items transform into a random artifact item. You also gain 1 artifact anvil and 2 item removers. You would take this if your units are great at using a random mix of items because it gives you random artifact items. So this is typically true of multi-carry comps with at least 1 attack damage, 1 ability power, 1 tank, and 1 support unit. That way, no matter what random artifact items you get, you can make use of it. So when should we pick these item augments? Item augments are typically best for win streaking in the early game. If you get the item right away, such as the red buff example, you get the most power on your board in the early game compared to all other augment types. This is because items give your primary carry more stats than a combat augment. If your primary carry or tank does not have 3 items, then you need to max that out ASAP. And item augments are the easiest way to do that in the early game because we have less loot at this time and therefore don't have 3 items on our important units. Item augments are also good when you are running a multi-carry comp. If we think about how to make powerful comps in TFT, we typically have 1 tank and 1 carry. After itemizing both of them, we already discussed how good a combat augment is to power them up even more. However, some comps have multiple carries, and when you do these types of comps, it's actually very difficult to get full items for 2 carries and a main tank, because that is 9 total items. Right now in TFT, by default, you get 7 by the time you reach stage 5, and having an item augment can help bridge this gap by getting you to 9 items much faster than waiting for the carousel rounds or the future dragon rounds to get more items. Now, what are multi-carry comps? Typically, multi-carry comps are comps that 3-star a lot of units or play a lot of 2-star 4 costs, though I do make a note of which comps fit this tag in my meta snapshot. Now we have to decide on what type of item augment to pick because there are so many different categories from before. Full items are great if they are the best in slot for your team, and they're also great for just generic value to win streak with. These are also good if you are running a multi-carry comp. Item component augments, on the other hand, are great if you have a lot of unbuilt components on your bench, or if you're playing something like Scrap. To get full value from these component augments, you'll want to build items as soon as possible after taking them, because that's how the developers balance them. Just like full items though, component augments are good for win streaking or if you have a multi-carry comp. Radiant items are a bit different from the first 2 categories because they are great for comps where you literally only care about 1 unit. Oftentimes this is a melee carry because they can act as both a tank and damage dealer through hitting champions and also life stealing. Similar to Radiant items, artifacts fill out that same requirement, but are a bit more flexible. Artifact items are kind of the midpoint between full items and Radiant items, where it can be argued both ways, where you can give a lot of power to a singular unit if you're doing a solo carry game, or it also could be good in multi-carry comps when you just need to itemize as many units as possible. Lastly, we have support items, which are actually a form of a combat augment as we discussed before, and these are great for solo carry teams, or if you already have 3 items on your primary units. Let's get into some examples of when you want to take some item augments. So right now he's on stage 4-2, he had 2 Econ Augments at the start, and he has a lot of unbuilt components on the left side of his screen. So what type of augment do you think he's going to be picking here? So he rerolls that one, rerolls this one, and he also rerolls the middle one. Then he eventually takes Spear's Will because that'll allow him to build a bunch of items, and it's also giving him a sword for his team, which is a pretty critical component. However, I did say item augments were really good in the early game for win streaking, so let's see what type of augment he takes at stage 2 here. We'll see that he has Scapegoat, Trade Sector, and Salvage Bin, but his board does not have many upgrades as we see here. He has a full 1-star board, so he's going to be skipping Salvage Bin and going for an Econ Augment instead. So that's one of those times where you don't want one of those item augments. For the last example, we are going to be in stage 4 again. Normally we do not take item augments here, we go for combat, but if we look at his board, he's got 3 items on Vi 3-star, he's got 1 item on Draven 3-star, so he needs to fill out that little last item slot. So he could get Piercing Lotus, he could get some of the other stuff here, but he's going to opt for Portable Forge instead so that he could get a full item on his Draven ideally. He alternatively can get an artifact item for his Vi because in this comp, sometimes you really only care about your Vi, and getting an artifact item makes them even stronger than they normally would be. Next, let's get into trait augments. Trait augments include crests and crowns, which give a specific trait emblem, along with specific trait augments, which give a bonus to a specific trait of units. So there are actually no silver trait augments, but there is one thing called branching out, which gives you a random emblem, and you would only take this in a patch where vertical traits are very strong. A gold trait augment would be something like Law Enforcement, which gives your Enforcer champions attack damage, and every 5 wanted enemy deaths give you gold, and you also get Enforcer champions. Of course, there are other examples of gold trait augments such as crests, which give you an emblem and sometimes a champion. Lastly, for prismatics, there are crowns, which are very similar to crests, but they also typically give you an item or item component that fits pretty decently with that trait. So when should you take a trait augment? I don't know if this needs to be said, but if you are going for a specific trait, you take that trait augment. They can kind of be considered a hybrid of a combat, item, and econ augment, since it makes your team passively stronger through getting the trait bonus. Sometimes it literally gives you an item, and sometimes it also gives you champions. If a trait is very good on the current patch, you'll definitely want to take the trait augment, but you may also need maybe 1 or 2 of the units that belong to that team comp or components to make that trait work before taking the augment for it. Picking a naked trait augment is very risky, even if it is considered the best augment in the game at that time. It's also good to take emblem augments if you have a way to build another copy of the emblem, because oftentimes traits have breakpoints that are 2 counts higher than the number of units available. For example, 7 Rebel is easy to hit because there are 8 Rebel units, but 10 Rebels is absolutely bonkers and sometimes gives you a free win. And the only way to do that is by getting 2 emblems of that trait to activate that. Trait augments are pretty easy. Here he's playing Kog'Maw reroll, and he's got an Amumu 3-star already. He has another Amumu 3-star on his bench. 3 items on Kog'Maw, 2 on Amumu, so you don't really need that item augment because he's probably going to get his 3rd Amumu item off of Carousel. So what do you think he's going to go for here? Well, he has 4 Watcher, and Watcher Crown shows up. Don't need any of the items. Well, ironically, he gets all item augments, and then you just go for the Watcher Crown. Go for 6 Watcher because you're playing that trait. I know Watcher isn't the most popular trait comp in the world, but in this other example, we see in stage 4-1 he's playing Scrap. On 4-2, he gets offered the Scrap emblem, so oh boy, I wonder what he's going to pick here. It's going to be the Scrap Crown. Next, let's get into a different type of trait and hero augments. So in set 13, Riot Games released a new type of augment called a trait augment, although I don't know why they chose this specific name because we already use the name trait augments for the whole category we talked about before, but I can kind of understand why they did this. When you take one of these new trait augments, On the left-hand side of your screen, it creates a new trait. And I completely get that. But again, it creates a ton of confusion because for the last 2 or 3 years, ever since we started using augments, people always use the term trait augments to refer to crests and crowns. They probably could have called these new type of trait augments maybe something like a partner, companion, duo, or team augment instead. If someone has a explanation from one of the developers on this, like such as a video or like a stream clip that explains why they named them trait augments, please link it down in the comments below. And if it doesn't exist, someone asked Mortdog in his stream for me. I'm assuming maybe like duo might be the best name, like a duo augment, because it normally buffs up 2 different champions. But let's get into what they are. Hero augments are augments that change the identity of a unit to make them into a carry in most cases. They're normally on like 1, 2, or 3 cost tank units, and it essentially changes the entire way you approach your specific game. Because after picking the hero augment, all your attention goes onto that one unit that you just changed, and it'll be like that for the rest of the game. When picking a hero augment, you also get a copy of that champion. Duo augments are pretty similar to hero augments. It creates a special bond between 2 champions, and they gain some sort of benefit from it, and you also get a copy of both of the champions, and you build your entire team comp around them. So some examples of this is a hero augment in silver, such as trolling, where you gain a trundle and your trundle's ability no longer heals but gains him attack speed and permanently gains him attack damage. His max mana is also reduced. You just go ahead and play a trundle build. Again, all these team comps for the hero augments and the trait augments are all available on bunnymuffins.lol/meta. A gold trait augment would be something like Sisters, which gives Jinx bonus attack speed whenever Vi gets a takedown, and whenever Jinx gets a takedown, Vi gets bonus attack damage, and you also get copies of these champions. And lastly, prismatic trait augments is something like Geniuses, where when Heimerdinger casts, Echo releases 3 after images dealing damage, and when Echo casts, Heimer fires some missiles. And the times when you would want to pick these augments is if you can meet 3 requirements. The first one is if the augment is currently strong. The second is if you already have existing copies of that champion. And lastly, if you have items for those champions. Most people in the past would just data check all the hero augments to see if they're good. But now that that is gone, we'll cover a secret but legal way on how to check the hero augment data anyways to figure out if these are actually good at the end of the video. But first, now that we covered all the major categories of augments that you'll encounter, I did want to mention that there are some hybrid or mixed augments that kind of dip into a few of these different categories. And as you can imagine, you may have already noticed some patterns. For example, the critical thinkers of Bunny Muffins viewers might have already left a comment saying, "You said that item augments are good for win streaking, but how come you said to lose streak with the augment eye for an eye?" Turns out some fall into multiple categories or break their own rules, such as an item augment being used for lose streaking. Another example is Be Right Back, which is technically a lose streak augment, but instead of giving you econ, it gives you items after it resolves, so it kind of works in the same way. It's technically a combat augment. Investment strategy, which give your units permanent max health per interest you earn, is technically a combat augment, but it is delayed, so you don't quite get the full power right away. Spoils of War is technically an econ and item augment, but you don't actually get power from it. You must actually kill units and ideally win rounds too to get maximum value. Bad Luck Protection is both an item augment and a combat augment because it gives you a component and a buff to your team. And there are many, many more examples of these types of like hybrid augments or like counterintuitive augments, because some things in TFT wear many, many hats. But now that we know when and how to pick each and every type of augment, how do we know what's going to be good? Because again, they removed augment data, so we can't just check to see if something's averaging like a 3.5. In general, the meta defines what's good. For example, if lose streaking is powerful, then econ and lose streak augments will almost always be good. If vertical traits are good, then wandering trainers, crowns and crests, and branching out would be good. But you still have to meet their requirements. If multi-carry comps are strong in a meta, or if win streaking is very powerful, then item augments are really good. If single carry comps are strong, then you want Radiant and Artifacts, or maybe something like Find Your Center. And if it's a pretty flexible meta where lots of different verticals are strong, ironically, something like Hard Commit could be good because you get a good comp no matter what. Now that we've covered when and how to pick every type of augment, let's get into the secret data methods that I've been teasing. So they did remove augment data from match history. However, I will say that everything I'm about to do and that you will do after watching this is actually legal and is not part of like a black market stat database. But you could probably make one of those if you cared that much about getting a slight advantage in a video game. Turns out a lot of implied data can be generated by getting creative with existing stats. For all my data needs, I'm going to head over to teamfight.lol, and if we think about augment data that we actually need to use, the only really important ones that we need to check are hero augments, trait augments, and the new duo augments. Because most oftentimes, different types of econ augments are good in different type of metas. Item augments, like you pretty much just take them if you need to win streak. And again, it's meta dependent on which items are strong. So we didn't actually lose that much by getting augment data removed. So let's start with trait augments. So all those crests and crowns, how do you know which crests and which crowns are going to be good? Well, you just go to stats and traits and then type in whatever trait you want to look up. So for example, enforcers, if you see that 8 enforcer is averaging like a 3.46, it's going to be good. If you have enforcer crest offered to you and you have any semblance of a direction of going enforcers, just auto take it. If you want to go for sorcerer, you might look it up and see that sorcerer is only a 4.53. So maybe sorcerer crest and crown are maybe not that great of a trait augment right now. So those are pretty simple to do. I will note that there is one caveat on this type of data, is that there sometimes are exceptions. For example, in a previous set, there was a time where a fairy comp was very, very powerful, but oddly enough, Fairy Crown, which gives a fairy emblem, a giant slayer, and some fairy champions, was actually not that great of an augment. And the reason why was because the item it gave, Giant Slayer, was not actually usable on any of the damage dealers in the comp. So that's why it was considered not that great, even though the trait was very strong. So that's the only like exception that I would like kind of make, but it's very, very rare. I think that's the only time that happened in like the past couple of sets, where the trait is strong, but one of the crowns is not. Now let's think about the duo augments. Literally, they show up as a trait in match history still. So if you want to figure out how good the sisters augment is, you just type in sisters and you see their average placement. Or maybe unlikely duo or menaces or whichever one you care about. You literally can just data check these. So again, these have not disappeared and the data still exists. One thing to note is teamfight.lol does this little thing where they show the average placement over here of all the games for whatever filters you set up. So for example, if you're looking at only plat games, only master, only diamond, things like that. So it's helpful to kind of get like a relative strength metric where sometimes the average is going to be 4.4, sometimes the average is going to be 3.9. Since it's the start of the set, the average placement is a little bit higher. So 4.21 is normally good, but right now it's actually below average, but this is the only site that has that. So we've taken care of crest and crown data checking, and now we did the new type of set 13 trait data checking. What about hero augments? Because those are very annoying. So one thing you could do, there are two ways to do this. You could either go to the Explorer or click on Champions. I think the Explorer is going to be a bit more accurate, but Champions is going to be a bit faster. For example, you could just type 1 here to look up all the 1-cost units, look at the 3-star average placement, and know which ones have hero augments available. For example, popular ones are going to be like Singed, Steb, Trundle, things like that. And we can see that Trundle, as a 3-star, he's a 4.71, so it's like there's no world where you ever want to take the Trundle augment in this patch. Of course, this can change in the future when they buff it. Steb, same thing, but there's an even better way to do it, which is going through the Explorer tool. Because in the champion stats, it just shows every type of 3-star champion, or like every 3-star Trundle game. But in the Explorer, you could figure out exactly which ones are using the hero augment. So for example, let's take a look at Vladimir. Vladimir's a frontline unit, and he's normally a tank, but when you take his hero augment, it turns him into a range character. So it literally gives him +3 range, and it kind of makes him into an auto-attacking mage. So what you can do is put in Vladimir, put him as 3-star, and then look at his items. So since a new set came out and a new patch just came out, I'm actually going to increase the filters a bit. No one is Master Plus yet, but I'll include all those filters, and we'll put in gold games too, just to get a bigger sample size. But literally, Vlad normally gets tank items because he is a frontliner, he's a tank, he's like a watcher. But if you get the hero augment, you're gonna put damage items on him. So you could just look at the stats and look at the damage items, and you'll see that like, oh, Rageblade, when would you ever put Rageblade on Vladimir unless he's in the backline, and see how well it's doing. So it's doing 4.21, Archangels is 4.17, Jeweled Gauntlet 4.14, and then this Gargoyle Stoneplate, which is obviously a tank item, 3.65. So you'll see that like damage Vladimir doesn't do that great because the overall average placement for this ranking is 3.94. So then you would know something like the Vladimir hero augment is not that great right now. You could do this check for every type of champion because again, they always use funky items that they normally don't use. I'll use a less obvious example in Steb. Steb is a bruiser, so he's normally in the front line. Let's make him 3-star. And then you'll see that like Gargo Stoneplate, 4.18, Warmog's 4.19, but most people, when they get his hero augment, they build like Bloodthirster, Titan's Resolve, and AP items like Archangels and Jeweled Gauntlet. And those average a lot worse. So then you're like, hey, Steb's augment probably sucks right now. So that's pretty much how you data check all the hero augments very easily. So now that we've covered all the important ones that we really care about, because it really sucks when you take a 5.0 average placement hero augment, because you pretty much just lose the game in those cases in previous sets. You can still data check it very easily if you use teamfight.lol's Explorer. But the last category I want to talk about are Econ Augments. You could essentially check how good they are based on what's in the meta. And you could do that by typing like 1 to check how good the 1-cost rerolls are, 2 to check how good the 2-cost rerolls are, and lastly 3 for the 3-cost rerolls. And that would essentially tell you how good things like teaming up is, where it gives you champion duplicators, or like prismatic ticket. If reroll is really good in the meta, then reroll augments are going to be good too. If fast 8 is really good and you check that by checking the 4-cost units, XP augments are going to be really good. You could use a combination of average placement and play rate for that. Now let's talk about item augments, such as artifact augments. You could check how good they are by looking at specific items or radiant items to see how good they are relative to the general average placement. If you see that on average, artifact items do really, really well, then things like Artifactory are going to be pretty good. Of course, you still have to run a comp that can use it very effectively. Next, let's talk about build different, because that is one of those comp defining augments. So normally we just type in build different and see the average placement, but we can't do that anymore. But we could do something else, because build different uses a lot of 4-cost units. You can type in something like Mbessa and Garen, which are both emissary units. Emissaries traits only activate if there are exactly 1 or 4 emissary units. And since you're running both of them, they'll cancel each other out. And you could do this cool thing where you could add in something like a Tristana and then actually exclude it from the dataset. And then here you'll be able to find all the other units that are played with this comp. It's often going to be 4-cost units because that's what build different is normally built around. And then you can see how well this comp kind of does. And you'll see right now it's performing a little bit below average. Another way to do this without the emissary, let's say that emissaries are not even played in build different, you could just add a bunch of different 4-cost champions which are meta. So for example, right now Elise is really strong, add her. Maybe you can include a second copy of Elise because maybe she's so good that you're running 2 of them. And then add some other 4-cost champions, maybe like a Heimerdinger, he's the most played, so add him. And then add in some other 4-cost champions, maybe Dr. Mundo because you need some tanks. And then to filter out the rest of the data, because they are played in similar comps, you just type in 4 and see how the other 4-cost comps are doing. This version actually does a lot better than the ones with emissary, so maybe you should play it this way without the Mbessa and Garen combo. Or maybe Elise is just OP. So that's like a quick and dirty way to kind of see how good build different is, but hopefully this showed you how to data check augments legally using existing data. Hopefully they don't remove this too, but pretty much for all the important ones that you actually care about, such as avoiding a 5.0 hero augment, we actually don't have that issue. But hopefully this video helped you understand what augments are, how to pick them, when to pick them, and how to check augment stats helped you out. So if it did, feel free to share this video with a friend who's also getting into TFT or already a current player that's trying to get a bit better. But that's going to be it for me today. Hopefully you all enjoyed this, and I'll see you all next time.